In his introduction to the now classic work Orientalism, Syed explains the concept of Orientalism, provides a backdrop for the study, and articulates the author's implicit biases. During the Civil War in 1975-76, when a French journalist visited Beirut, he felt deeply saddened by the sight of its once lively downtown area in ruins. The journalist compared the destruction to the romanticized depictions of the Orient by writers such as Chateaubriand and Nerval. For Europeans, held a significant attraction, steeped in notions of romance, exoticism, and historical resonance. However, as the journalist observed, this representation of the Orient was fading away, its time seemingly over. Americans usually associate the Orient more with the Far East, such as China and Japan. While they may not share the same depth of tradition in Orientalism as the French and British, other European nations also have a long history of engaging with the Orient in various ways. Orientalism, terms it, represents a European approach to understanding and interacting with the Orient, which encompasses its geographical proximity to Europe, its colonial past, its cultural significance, and its role as a defining contrast to the Western identity. This European understanding of the Orient is not solely based on imagination. It is deeply rooted in material civilization and culture. Orientalism permeates European discourse through institutions, scholarship, imagery, and colonial practice, shaping perceptions and interactions with the East. One of the most commonly acknowledged definitions of Orientalism is an academic one, still employed in numerous educational institutions. Anyone engaged in teaching, writing about, or researching the Orient, be they anthropologists, sociologists, historians, or philologists, whether in specific or general aspects, can be considered an Orientalist, and their activities can be termed Orientalism. Beyond its academic connotations, Orientalism also encompasses a broader meaning. It represents a style of thought founded on an ontological and epistemological division between the Orient and the Occident. Countless writers, including poets, novelists, philosophers, political theorists, economists, and imperial administrators, have adopted fundamental East-West distinction as the foundation for intricate theories, narratives, epics, novels, social descriptions, and political analysis concerning the Orient, its inhabitants, customs, psyche, fate, and more. The expansive notion of Orientalism encompasses figures as diverse as Aeschylus, Victor Hugo, Dante, and Karl Marx. The interplay between the academic and imaginative facets of Orientalism has been ongoing since the late 18th century, with a significant, often regulated exchange between the two realms. This leads to the third meaning of Orientalism, which is more historically and materially grounded than the previous two. From the late 18th century onwards, Orientalism can be examined as a corporate institution responsible for engaging with the Orient, articulating statements about it, authorizing perspectives, describing it, teaching about it, colonizing it, governing it. In essence, Orientalism functions as a Western mode of dominating, restructuring, and asserting authority over the Orient. Drawing from Michel Foucault's concept of discourse as outlined in his works The Archaeology of Knowledge and Discipline and Punish, Orientalism can be understood as a discourse, a systematically structured way of managing and even fabricating the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively during the Enlightenment era. Orientalism held such authoritative sway that anyone who wrote, thought, or acted regarding the Orient had to contend with its limitations on thought and action. It does not unilaterally dictate what can be said about the Orient, but rather constitutes a complex network of interests that inevitably influences any discussion involving the Orient. The essence of Orientalism arises from a unique proximity and engagement between Britain, France, and the Orient, which initially, until early 19th century, primarily meant India and the lands mentioned in the Bible. From the 19th century until the conclusion of World War II, France and Britain held sway over the Orient and Orientalism. However, since World War II, America has assumed dominance in the Orient and approaches it with a perspective reminiscent of that of France and Britain. This close interaction, though often demonstrating the greater power of the Western nations, has generated a substantial body of texts that Syed refers to as Orientalist. Orient is not a static fact of nature. It is not merely an objective reality, just as the Occident is not. Vico's insightful observation that humans shape their own history applies equally to geography, both as geographical and cultural entities. Locales like the Orient and the Occident are human constructs. Therefore, much like the West, the Orient is an idea with a history and a tradition of thought, imagery, and vocabulary that have endowed it with reality and significance in the Western imagination. These two geographical entities mutually inform and reflect each other. However, several important qualifications must be made. Firstly, it would be erroneous to conclude that the Orient is purely an idea or a creation devoid of corresponding reality. When Disraeli, in his novel Tancred, remarked that the East was he meant that it held a profound fascination for young Westerners. However, this should not be misconstrued as suggesting that the East existed solely as a pursuit for Westerners. Cultures and nations exist in the East with histories and customs that possess a tangible reality far surpassing any Western descriptions. While this study of Orientalism may not directly contribute to understanding these Eastern realities, it implicitly acknowledges their existence. Instead, the focus lies primarily on the internal consistency of Orientalist ideas about the Orient, irrespective of their correspondence with a supposed real Orient. Secondly, ideas, cultures, and histories cannot be comprehensively understood or studied without considering the dynamics of power inherent within them. To suggest that the Orient was merely created or orientalized as a product of the imagination would be disingenuous. The relationship between the Occident and the Orient is one of power, domination, and varying degrees of hegemony, as aptly captured by K.M. Panikar's seminal work Asia and Western Dominance. The Orient was orientalized not solely because it was perceived to possess certain Oriental characteristics by Europeans, but also because it could be subjected to such orientalization. This process of domination is exemplified by Flaubert's encounter with an Egyptian courtesan, wherein he not only physically possessed her but also spoke for her, representing her emotions, presence, and history. This leads us to a third important qualification. It would be mistaken to view Orientalism merely as a structure built upon falsehoods or myths, which would crumble if the truth were exposed. While Syed personally believes that Orientalism serves as a manifestation of European Atlantic power over the Orient rather than as a truthful discourse about it, we must acknowledge and attempt to comprehend the robust coherence of Orientalist discourse. Its close association with socio-economic and political institutions, as well as its enduring durability, must be recognized. Orientalism is not merely a fanciful European fantasy about the Orient. It is a constructed body of theory and practice that has been materially invested in for many generations. This sustained investment has solidified Orientalism as a system of knowledge through which the Orient is filtered into Western consciousness. The continued investment in Orientalism has enabled its proliferation throughout Western culture. Gramsci's useful analytical distinction between civil and political society highlights the role of cultural hegemony in shaping societal norms and values. Cultural hegemony operates within civil society through the dissemination of ideas and institutions, fostering consent rather than direct domination. Orientalism is deeply intertwined with the idea of Europe, which delineates a collective European identity in contrast to non European others. European ideas about the Orient reinforce notions of European superiority over Oriental cultures, often overriding alternative perspectives. Orientalism strategically relies on a flexible positional superiority, maintaining the Westerners' relative upper hand in their interactions with the Orient. This dominance was particularly pronounced during the period of European ascendancy from the late Renaissance onwards. Scholars, missionaries, traders, and soldiers were able to engage with the Orient with minimal resistance from Eastern societies. Under the guise of knowledge of the Orient, a complex framework emerged, suitable for academic study, museum display, colonial administration, and theoretical exploration in various disciplines. However, this imaginative examination of the Orient was predominantly shaped by Western consciousness, driven by desires, repressions, investments, and projections. Orientalism therefore encompasses a spectrum of cultural productions ranging from scholarly endeavors to more sensationalist and ideologically driven narratives. It is essential to continually question whether the essence of Orientalism lies in overarching ideological frameworks permeating a vast body of material, often imbued with doctrines of European superiority. Various forms of racism, imperialism, and rigid conceptions of the Oriental as an idealized and unchanging abstraction are in the diverse array of works produced by countless individual writers, each offering unique perspectives on the Orient. In reality, these two alternatives are complementary perspectives on the same subject matter, whether examining pioneers like William Jones or celebrated artists like Nerval or Flaubert. Both approaches necessitate engagement with individual authors, shaping Orientalist discourse. Employing both general and specific perspectives allows for a more comprehensive understanding of Orientalism. There is inherent risk of distortion if one adopts an overly general or overly localized focus system. To avoid distortion and inaccuracies, particularly those arising from excessively dogmatic generality or overly positivistic localized analysis, Syed seeks guidance from three key aspects of contemporary reality, which offer potential solutions to methodological and perceptual difficulties. Firstly, recognizing individuality within the broader context of a hegemonic framework involves acknowledging the agency and intelligence of individual authors who actively contribute to and shape Orientalist discourse. They are not merely passive recipients of a dominant ideology, but engage with it in a nuanced and complex ways. Secondly, maintaining a balance between general and specific analysis helps to avoid the pitfalls of either overly broad generalizations or excessively narrow focus. By integrating both perspectives, it becomes possible to capture the intricate interplay between overarching themes and individual contributions within Orientalism. Finally, understanding Orientalism requires a nuanced approach that acknowledges its complexities and contradictions. This involves recognizing the multiplicity of voices within Orientalist discourse while examining the broader socio-political context that shapes and informs it. After explaining three aspects of colonialism from the perspective of contemporary reality, Syed briefly explains how they influences his particular approach to research and writing. What Syed argues in the study of Orientalism is that all academic knowledge about regions like India and Egypt is inherently influenced by political reality. European or American scholars studying the Orient cannot disclaim their own circumstances. They encounter the Orient first as Europeans or Americans and only second as individuals. This awareness of belonging to a powerful entity with interests in the Orient shapes their perspectives. Orientalism is not simply a passive reflection of political subject matter, nor is it a collection of texts about the Orient. Instead, it is a distribution of geopolitical awareness across various disciplines and texts. It is an elaboration of geographical distinctions, the manifestation of various interests, and a discourse shaped by exchanges with political, intellectual, cultural, and moral powers. Orientalism is deeply intertwined with modern political intellectual culture, reflecting more about our world rather than about the Orient itself. Orientalism exists not in an archival vacuum, but within distinct and intellectually discernible lines. Just as scholars recognize the intertextuality of texts, they must also acknowledge the influence of political, institutional, and ideological constraints on individual authors. Orientalism forces us to confront the reality that political imperialism governs entire fields of study, making its avoidance intellectually and historically impossible. Syed approaches the study of Orientalism as a dynamic exchange between individual authors and the broader political concerns shaped by the dominant empires, British, French, and American, that governed the intellectual and imaginative landscape in which these writings emerged. What captivates Syed as a scholar is not the crude political truth that Occidentals are superior to Orientals, but rather the nuanced evidence found in the detailed work of figures like Lane, Flaubert, or Renan, who operated within the expansive framework established by such beliefs. Syed's inquiry into Orientalism seeks to unravel the intricate interplay between cultural production, political ideologies, state power, and the realities of domination. By addressing these concerns, a humanistic study can be responsibly engaged with the intersection of politics and culture. However, it is important to note that there is no rigid rule governing the relationship between knowledge and politics. Each investigation must navigate this connection within the specific context of its subject matter and historical circumstances. Attempting an encyclopedic narrative history of Orientalism seemed impractical for several reasons. Syed focuses on the British, French, and American experience of the Orient as a cohesive unit, considering the historical and intellectual background that shaped the experience. Britain and France's dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean from the late 17th century onwards shaped their positions in Oriental studies. There has been significant scholarship on the background of biblical studies contributing to the emergence of modern Orientalism. The German Orient was predominantly scholarly or classical, unlike the tangible experiences of Egypt or Syria for writers like Chateaubriand, Lane, and Lamartine. While German Orientalism refined techniques applicable to texts and ideas from the Orient, it did not share the same direct engagement with the region as its Anglo-French counterpart. Nonetheless, German Orientalism, like its Anglo-French and American counterparts, held intellectual authority over the Orient within Western culture. There is nothing inherently mysterious or natural about authority. Rather, it is constructed, disseminated, and wielded strategically. Authority is instrumental and persuasive, establishing canons of taste and value while blurring the lines between certain ideas and traditions it legitimizes as true. It is virtually indistinguishable from the perceptions, judgments, and traditions it shapes and transmits. Above all, authority indeed must be subjected to analysis. Syed's principal methodological tools for studying authority are strategic location and strategic formation. Strategic location refers to the author's position within a text concerning the Oriental material they discuss, while strategic formation analyzes the relationship between texts and how they collectively acquire mass, density, and referential power within culture. Syed employs the notion of strategy to address the inherent challenge every writer on the Orient faces: how to engage with it without being overwhelmed by its complexity. Each writer must situate themselves vis-a-vis the Orient, which is reflected in their narrative voice, structural choices, and thematic elements. Moreover, every work on the Orient draws upon previous knowledge and affiliations with other works, audiences, and institutions, forming analyzable formations that quantity. Orientalism is fundamentally premised upon exteriority, wherein the Orientalist portrays the Orient for Western audiences, positioning themselves as outside observers. This exteriority culminates in representation, where the Orient is transformed into familiar symbols for Western consumption. It is essential to recognize that cultural discourse circulates representations rather than truth. Language itself is a highly organized system of representation, and written statements about the Orient derive their efficacy not from the Orient itself, but from Western techniques of representation. Orientalism relies on Western institutions, traditions, and conventions to make the Orient visible and comprehensible within discourse. Thus, Orientalism is fundamentally a product of the West, indebted to Western codes of understanding rather than any inherent characteristics of the Orient itself. The distinction before the late 18th century and those of modern Orientalism lies in the vast expansion of representation in the latter period. While Europe had gained scientific knowledge of the Orient through figures like William Jones as well as Napoleon's expedition to Egypt, what truly mattered was the broadened scope and enhanced refinement of techniques for engaging with the Orient. Europeans played a pivotal role in uncovering the ancient languages of the Orient, which led to the emergence of Indo-European philology and related scientific interests. Artists and writers such as William Beckford, Goethe, and Victor Hugo reshaped the Orient through their works of art, making its colors, lights, and people visible through their imagery and motifs. The real Orient rarely dictated a writer's vision, but rather served as inspiration for their creative expression. Orientalism was more responsive to the culture that produced it than to its supposed object, which was also shaped by the West. Thus, the history of Orientalism exhibits both internal consistency and intricate relationships with the dominant culture surrounding it. While Orientalism functions as a system of sight and others, individual writers leave a determining imprint on the discourse. The nexus of knowledge and power that constructs and marginalizes the Oriental is not merely an academic concern, but a deeply personal and political one. In his prison notebooks, Gramsci famously asserts that the starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is and is knowing thyself as a product of the historical process to date, which has deposited in you an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. However, the available English translation inexplicably omits the concluding statement in Gramsci's Italian text, which emphasizes the imperative of compiling such an inventory. Much of the personal investment in Syed's study of Orientalism stems from his own upbringing as a child in two British colonies. Despite receiving a Western education, his early awareness of being labeled as an Oriental has persisted, motivating him to examine the traces of cultural dominance left upon him and others like him. The circumstances enabling such study are complex. Since the 1950s, particularly in the United States, the relationship between East and West has been marked by extraordinary turbulence. The concept of the East has often been associated with danger and threat, leading to the establishment of area studies programs in universities as part of national policy. Moreover, the proliferation of media, especially in the postmodern era, has reinforced stereotypes of the Orient, intensifying the 19th century demonology of the mysterious Orient. This is particularly evident in the perception of the Near East, which has become highly politicized due to historical prejudices, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the absence of a nuanced cultural position on Arabs and Islam. By highlighting the parallels between Orientalism and anti-Semitism, Syed hopes to contribute a better understanding of how cultural dominance operates and to stimulate new approaches to the Orient that transcend outdated dichotomies between East and West. Syed's goal is to contribute to the process of unlearning the mode perpetuated by Western culture.